So, chapter 42 is about ecosystems and energy. So, we'll talk about how physical laws apply to ecosystems. We'll talk about energy transfer. We'll talk about pyramids of energy and pyramids of biomass, and inverted pyramids of biomass, and biogeochemical cycles, and restoration ecology. So in ecosystems, we see that energy flows and matter or nutrients cycles in the ecosystem because largely primary producers are getting energy from the sun and passing it through the different trophic levels, but the energy never returns to the sun. And then we think about where our primary producers, which are typically going to be plants, are getting their nutrients from. Their nutrients are coming from the soil. Those nutrients are getting passed down to the different trophic levels and eventually one way or another returns back to the soil. So that's why we say matter or nutrients or chemicals are going to cycle in an ecosystem. And ecosystems can range in size from a little teeny tiny space under like a fallen log or a desert spring to a big huge lake or even a forest. Ecologists are going to study transformation of energy and movement of chemical elements within ecosystems, and these things are going to still follow physical laws. So the first law of thermodynamics says energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred or transformed, and the second law of thermodynamics says that every exchange of energy increases the entropy of the universe. In 160, you probably talked about that stuff when you talked about like cell respiration and that sort of thing. I think it was in that same unit. And then also ecosystems follow the conservation of mass, where matter cannot be created or destroyed. So again, energy is typically transferred from the sun and then transformed into chemical energy by our producers. So our photosynthetic organisms are going to produce carbohydrates from carbon dioxide in the environment and water in the environment and energy from the sun. And then some of that energy is dissipated as heat. Energy conversions from one trophic level to the next are not completely efficient, and some energy is always, I'm doing scare quotes, lost as heat. It's not so much that it's actually lost, it's just not transferred directly to the organism in a useful form there. And I don't know, I put this picture because I thought it was super cute. So maybe not the most scientifically accurate picture, but adorable nonetheless. And it's showing you like your photosynthetic organism gets energy from the sun. Some of that energy is lost, quote, quote, as heat, right? The plants are eaten by herbivores, but not all of the plant energy makes it to the herbivore. The fox eats the herbivore. Not all the herbivore energy makes it to the fox, etc., etc. So elements are continually recycled. Inorganic elements are taken up by autotrophs and transformed into biomass. Organic compounds, like carbohydrates, are transferred to heterotrophs as food, and then inorganic elements are released by metabolism and decomposition. Ecosystems are open systems, meaning they can absorb energy and mass and release heat and waste products. Elements can be gained or lost from a particular ecosystem. For example, a forest ecosystem has nutrients enter as dust or solutes in rain, and then those nutrients can also be carried away in water. So ecosystems can be a source or a sink for a particular element. If a mineral nutrient's output exceeds its input, it's going to limit production in that particular system. Energy and nutrients pass from primary producers, our autotrophs, so like our plants, to our primary consumers, so herbivores, to secondary consumers, carnivores, to tertiary consumers, which would be carnivores that feed on other carnivores. We also have detritivores or decomposers that are consuming detritus, which is just our non-living organic matter, so they're breaking down dead stuff and waste products. And the detritivores or decomposers are going to connect all of the trophic levels together, and the detritivores are going to be fed on by secondary and tertiary consumers. Prokaryotic organisms and fungi are really important to decomposition. So here's just like a simple picture, and let's label our trophic levels. So our plant there is going to be our primary producer. Caterpillar eats the plant, so that's going to be primary consumer. Bird that eats the caterpillar, secondary consumer. Bird that eats the other bird, tertiary consumer. And then you've got our microbes and insects down there, and those are our detritivores. So primary production is the amount of light energy that's converted to chemical energy by autotrophs during a given time period. Rarely chemoautotrophic organisms are primary producers. So like we talked about those hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. Since there's no light down there, photosynthetic organisms are not the base of that group or base of that ecosystem. Instead, chemoautotrophic organisms are, but really they're kind of the exception to the rule, so it's better to just think about primary production being photosynthetic organisms. only a small fraction of solar energy actually strikes photosynthetic organisms, and even less of that is at a usable wavelength. Remember, photosynthesis tends to take place in the red and blue wavelengths of light, and other wavelengths are not useful for photosynthesis. So the extent of photosynthetic production sets a spending limit for an ecosystem. So we can kind of think of an ecosystem having an energy budget. When we talk about primary production, we can break primary production into gross primary production and net primary production. Gross primary production is an ecosystem's total primary production measured as the conversion of chemical energy from photosynthesis per unit time. The net primary production is the gross primary production minus the energy used for autotrophic respiration. What in the world is autotrophic respiration? Right, autotrophic respiration is cellular respiration. So your autotrophic organism is making carbohydrates, correct? But they're also using those carbohydrates for cell respiration to make their ATP. So net primary production is their take-home carbohydrate production. This can either be expressed as energy per unit area per unit time, or as biomass added per unit area per unit time. And really, it's the amount of new biomass added in a given time period. So we can also talk about net ecosystem production. This is a measure of the total biomass accumulation during a given period. Net ecosystem production is the gross primary production minus the total respiration of all organisms, producers and consumers in an ecosystem. So net ecosystem production is estimated by comparing the net influx of carbon dioxide and oxygen in an ecosystem. These molecules are connected by photosynthesis and respiration. The release of oxygen by a system is an indication that it's also storing carbon dioxide. Because if we go back to photosynthesis, in the light reactions, photosynthesis splits water and produces oxygen, and those electrons are used to make your ATP and NADPH. Then the NADPH and ATP go on to the next cycle, the Calvin cycle, and you make your carbohydrate there, your G3P. So if you're releasing oxygen, you're also storing CO2. In aquatic ecosystems, these can be limited by both light and nutrients, and they're limited by light because half of the solar radiation is absorbed in about the first 15 meters of water, and only 5 to 10% of solar radiation reaches up to 75 meters. Remember in the previous chapter we talked about the photic and aphotic zone, so that should be a little bit of a review there. Also, aquatic ecosystems can be limited by nutrients. Nutrients limit primary production in oceans and lakes more than light. Nitrogen and phosphorus most often limit marine production. But some nutrient enrichment experiments have indicated that iron, which is actually a micronutrient, can be limited in some marine ecosystems. In a previous chapter, we talked about oligotrophic and eutrophic bodies of water, and we said oligotrophic were nutrient poor and eutrophic were nutrient rich. Eutrophication is when we add large amounts of nutrients into aquatic ecosystems. This causes large populations of phytoplankton to bloom, and they're supported. But since these individual lifespans are short, this leads to decomposition of these phytoplankton or algae, and the decomposition of those organisms causes an oxygen depletion, and then the oxygen depletion causes a loss of any organism that needs oxygen. So this is a kind of famous experiment here where they call it a curtain, which sounds like fabric or something like that, but they have this curtain, which you can see as this yellow line across the middle of the lake there, and on one side of it, it was fertilized with carbon and nitrogen, and on the other side it was fertilized with carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And on the side with the phosphorus you got a blue-green algal bloom. So in lakes it's apparent that phosphorus limits cyanobacterial growth more often than nitrogen does. In terrestrial ecosystems, primary production is limited by temperature and moisture typically. Mean annual precipitation and evapotranspiration are useful predictors of net primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. And recall again, evapotranspiration is that evaporation from the soil and transpiration from plant body surfaces. And evapotranspiration increases with temperature and the amount of solar radiation. This graph here has the mean annual precipitation in centimeters on the x-axis and mean annual primary production, above ground dry mass basically of plants, on the y-axis. And you can see as annual precipitation increases, there tends to be a trend where biomass of plants is going to increase as well. Soil nutrients can also limit primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. Globally, nitrogen is the most limited nutrient in terrestrial ecosystems, but phosphorus can also be a limited nutrient, especially in older soils or soils with a more alkaline pH. However, plants do have adaptations to help them access these limited nutrients. We've talked about these sorts of things before, like mutualisms with nitrogen-fixing bacteria or mutualisms with mycorrhizal fungi. Remember, those are the root fungi that increase the surface area of their roots. Roots themselves have root hairs that increase their surface area, and some plants release enzymes that increase the availability of limiting nutrients. Energy does transfer between the trophic levels. Secondary production of an ecosystem is the amount of chemical energy and food converted to new biomass during a given period, and net secondary production is the energy used for growth and reproduction. So if we look at primary productivity, you've got your gross primary productivity, which is then broken down into your net primary productivity when you get rid of the losses due to cell respiration. And then we have a caterpillar eating that plant, so we get secondary productivity. Secondary productivity, we have gross, which is the total, and then net secondary production, which does not include losses due to cell respiration or loss due to heat, but does include feces and tissue production. So production efficiency is the fraction of energy stored in food that's used for secondary production. So production efficiency equals the net secondary production times 100% divided by the assimilation of primary production. Assimilation is the total energy consumed and used for growth and reproduction and respiration. Herbivores use about 1/6 of the total energy stored in vegetation to produce new biomass. I always think of that like if anybody has a horse or other livestock, like how much hay does it take to run a horse, right? A lot of hay to run a horse, because herbivores can only use about 1/6 of the total energy stored in vegetation to produce new biomass. So let's match the terms to the description. If you want to go ahead and pause it and then catch back up with me, I would recommend that. So number 1 says the total rate at which material is produced by autotrophs. So what is an autotroph? Autotroph would be like your plant. And number 1 and 2 kind of go together, because number 2 is the rate at which material is produced by autotrophs in excess of respiration. So number 1 is the total produced by autotrophs. Number 2 is the take-home pay that autotrophs get. So are we dealing with primary or secondary production there? 1 and 2 are talking about primary production. So 1 is actually D, gross primary production, and 2 is actually C, net primary production, because that's your take-home pay of primary production for your plants. So then 3 and 4 are dealing with secondary production. 3 says the total rate at which material is produced by heterotrophs, and 4 says the total rate at which material is produced by heterotrophs in excess of cellular respiration. So 3 is going to be our gross secondary production, or A, and 4 is going to be our take-home, so that's going to be B, our net secondary production. It's important to realize, like, even though we're going to give you a rule for production efficiency, really it varies across organisms. So birds and mammals have production efficiencies in the range of 1 to 3% because they have the high cost of endothermy. What's endothermy again? Right, you maintain your body temperature with your metabolism. That takes energy to do. One of the things they tell you if you're hiking and you're worried about being hypothermic is to have snacks with you. Obviously that is not the only thing that will help you avoid hypothermia, but it is an important thing because it takes energy to maintain your body temperature. Fish have production efficiencies around 10%, and insects and microorganisms have efficiencies of 40% or more. When we talk about trophic efficiency, this is the percentage of production that's transferred from one trophic level to the next trophic level. We're going to say on average it's about 10%. Again, that's not entirely correct, but it's roughly 10%. So this takes into account the energy lost through respiration and feces, and energy stored in unconsumed portions of the organisms as well. So trophic efficiency is going to be multiplied over the length of a food chain. So approximately 0.1% of chemical energy fixed by photosynthesis reaches a tertiary consumer. So here's kind of an idealized pyramid of energy. So in this case, we're looking at energy from sunlight that makes it to primary producers, that makes it to primary consumers, then secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. You can see there's not much energy left for the tertiary consumers. If we look at a biomass pyramid, this is where we're looking at total dry mass of all the organisms in one trophic level. And each tier represents the standing crop, and most biomass pyramids show a sharp decrease at successively higher trophic levels. There's just not that many tertiary consumers because it takes lots of secondary consumers to run a tertiary consumer, and lots of primary consumers to feed a secondary consumer, and lots of primary producers to feed those primary consumers. So typically we're going to expect a biomass pyramid to be heavy at the bottom on the primary producer level, and light at the top in the mass of tertiary consumers supported. However, in some cases you can see an inverted biomass pyramid. In certain aquatic ecosystems, the primary consumers actually outweigh the primary producers, because the primary producers, like phytoplankton, are consumed quickly, but they reproduce faster and can support a larger biomass of consumers. So here in this one, you can see there's more zooplankton, which is your animal-like plankton that eat the phytoplankton, than there are phytoplankton. But since the phytoplankton, your producers, reproduce rapidly, they can support a larger population of consumers. Biogeochemical cycles have both biotic and abiotic, so living and non-living components, and these cycles can either be global or local. Some cycles, like carbon and oxygen and sulfur and nitrogen, have a gaseous phase and enter the atmosphere and then cycle globally, while others, like phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, are heavier, so they don't have a gaseous phase, and they cycle locally in terrestrial ecosystems, but more broadly when they're dissolved in aquatic systems. Decomposers play a really key role in chemical or nutrient cycling. The rate of nutrient cycling varies greatly among ecosystems, mostly as a result of decomposition rate. Decomposer growth and decomposition rate are controlled by factors like temperature and moisture and nutrient availability. But I feel like most of you know temperature and moisture control decomposition, right? Beef jerky can sit out of the refrigerator a lot longer than just a steak can. And then you put your steak in the refrigerator because you're trying to control the temperature and prevent decomposition, because you want to eat your steak. You don't want microorganisms eating your steak. Rapid decomposition actually results in relatively low levels of nutrients in the soil. I think in tropical rainforest, people would maybe imagine that they had nutrient-rich soil, but they actually have nutrient-poor soil because the material decomposes so rapidly. Most of the nutrients get tied up in living things in tropical soils. Decomposition is going to be slow when soils are either too dry or too wet and low in oxygen. So anaerobic muds of aquatic ecosystems are going to have low decomposition rates. And if anybody has a compost pile, getting oxygen into your compost pile, you do that by like turning your compost, depending on what kind of system you have going on. That's going to increase your rate of decomposition, which will get you your nutrient-rich compost there that you can put on your plants. Sediments are a nutrient sink. In aquatic ecosystems, they require exchange between the bottom layers and the surface water to be highly productive. So temperature can affect litter decomposition in an ecosystem. On this graph, you've got mean annual temperature on the x-axis and percent of mass lost on the y-axis, and generally speaking, as temperature increases, decomposition increases. So I'm going to go over a couple cycles in the next couple of slides, and I want you to know why this particular nutrient is important to living things, how living things acquire this nutrient, where like the sink or the reservoir for this nutrient is, and how humans have altered these cycles. And also I want you to know the key processes. But don't get super hung up on the key processes. We're just kind of doing an overview. So why water matters to living things? I mean, living things are like 70% water, give or take, depending on what you are. So all living things need water. Typically, living things are getting liquid water, although some can harvest water vapor. And the oceans contain about 97% of the Earth's water. 2% is in glaciers and polar ice caps. 1% is in lakes, rivers, and groundwater. I don't care that you know the exact percentages there, but I have a rough idea. You know, oceans contain the majority of the water, and only 1% roughly is in lakes, rivers, groundwater, but don't memorize the numbers there. Key processes include evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, and movement through surface and groundwater. I think the ones that people tend to forget is transpiration, which is loss of water from plant body surfaces. In the image there, it ties up evaporation and transpiration together in evapotranspiration. So evaporation from the land itself, transpiration from plant body surfaces. So evapotranspiration from land is including both of those things. So that is our water cycle. Carbon cycle is important because all organic molecules contain carbon. So living things are made up of organic molecules, so we definitely need carbon for that. Photosynthetic organisms convert carbon dioxide to organic molecules, so the gaseous phase of carbon is useful there. Reservoirs for the carbon cycle include fossil fuels, soil and sediment, solutes in the ocean, actually plant and animal biomass themselves, because again, we're organic based, right? Carbon-based life forms, as they would say on like a sci-fi show. And we also have carbon in the atmosphere in the form of CO2, and then sedimentary rocks have carbon as well. So key processes is that carbon dioxide is taken up by the process of photosynthesis and released into the atmosphere through cellular respiration, also released through volcanic activity and the burning of fossil fuels. The nitrogen cycle is important because nitrogen is part of amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids. Those are things that are all important to life, and nitrogen often limits primary productivity. The forms that are available to life include ammonium, nitrate, and amino acids. Bacteria can also use nitrite, and animals can only use organic forms of nitrogen. So the atmosphere is the main nitrogen reservoir with nitrogen gas. Other reservoirs include soils, aquatic sediments, surface and groundwater, and biomass itself. And key processes include biotic and abiotic fixation of nitrogen gas, nitrification of ammonium to nitrate, and denitrification of nitrate to nitrogen gas, and human inputs including agricultural fertilization, legume crops, and nitrogen gas emissions. So here's a picture of the nitrogen cycle. Key thing to focus here is on nitrogen fixation. Remember, we talked about nitrogen fixing bacteria and root nodules of plants before. The phosphorus cycle is important to us because phosphorus makes up ATP. Phosphorus is in phospholipids and also nucleic acids, all things important to life. Living things can take phosphate and that's really our most important form of phosphorus. And reservoirs for phosphorus include sedimentary rocks, the soil, oceans, and organisms themselves. And key processes include the weathering of rocks and leaching into the ground and surface water, and incorporation into organic molecules, excretion by animals, and decomposition. So in 1983, well over 2 million tons of phosphorus was used annually in the U.S. for detergents alone. By 2010, 17 U.S. states implemented mandatory bans on the sale of phosphates in automatic dishwasher detergent. Why would phosphates in detergents be banned? So for this one, it's important to realize that if you have phosphates in detergents, they're going to get into your water system, and if we get phosphates in water, what's going to happen? That leads to eutrophication. So we have a cultural eutrophication where we have an excess of nutrients in an aquatic ecosystem. That leads to algal blooms. Those algae have a short life cycle, so they die. Decomposers break them down. That leads to low oxygen levels. Things that need oxygen to live, not going to be living anymore, right? So you get huge fish kills, things like that. If you've ever seen like a pond turn over, like a farm pond turn over, something like that, then that is eutrophication happening in real life. There's actually been some pretty large-scale experiments looking at nutrient cycling. In particular, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest is a good example of this. In this experiment, they measured the mineral budget for 6 valleys in this experimental forest by measuring input and output of key nutrients. They collected rainfall, and they created a dam to measure mineral outputs. So about 60% of the precipitation exited through the stream and about 40% was lost by evapotranspiration. And internal cycling conserved most of the mineral nutrients in the system, and small gains in nutrients were actually measured in most years. Another famous experiment from the Hubbard Brook Forest included where they clear-cut the trees in a valley and sprayed the valley with herbicide. So they removed the plants from a watershed, and you can see a picture of that to the right there. The net losses of water were 30 to 40% greater in this deforested site than in the undisturbed control site, and nutrient loss was also much greater here as well compared to the undisturbed site. For example, nitrate levels increased 60 times in the outflow from the deforested site. So the amount of nutrients leaving a forest ecosystem is mainly controlled by the plants. And maybe you would need to clear cut a forest and spray it with herbicide to do that or know that, but now we know like how big of an impact that has. So here they've got a graph. They have the years on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you've got nitrate concentration in runoff in milligrams per liter. And so they've got the deforested site in red and the control site in blue. And if you notice, on the y-axis, there's actually a break in the graph. So the graph goes milligrams per milliliters. It goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. They put a break in the graph, and then there's 20. So the deforested site was so much different than the control site. We actually had to make a graph with a break in the graph, and they changed the scale as well. Above the break, it goes 20, 40, 60, 80. So you can see we lost lots of nutrients or lots of nitrate in that deforested site compared to the control site. If we give them enough time, biological communities can recover from things like deforestation. However, restoration ecology seeks to make that go faster. We want to speed up the recovery of degraded ecosystems. There's 2 key strategies, either bioremediation or bioaugmentation, that can be used. Bioremediation is using living things to detoxify an ecosystem, and bioaugmentation is using organisms to add essential materials to a degraded ecosystem. The long-term objective for restoration projects worldwide is to return ecosystems as much as possible to their pre-disturbance state. So here's a gravel clay mine in New Jersey before and after restoration. So here it is in 1991 before restoration, and 2000 near the completion of restoration. So let's review. Label the examples as either bioremediation or bioaugmentation. And as always, if you want to pause it and come back to me, you're welcome to. So adding mycorrhizal fungi can help plants access nutrients from the soil. Is that remediation or augmentation? That's going to be augmentation. The next one says bacterial metabolize uranium and other elements to insoluble forms that are less likely to leach into streams than groundwater. That is bioremediation. The next one, nitrogen fixing plants can increase the available nitrogen in the soil. That is bioaugmentation. And then the last one, after accidental release of petroleum products, oh no, right? Microorganisms can be utilized to clean up petroleum hydrocarbon pollutants. That is bioremediation. So we made it to the end. We talked about physical laws and ecosystems. Ecosystems can't break physical laws. We talked about primary production, so biomass of our, photosynthetic organisms. Secondary production, biomass of the things that eat the primary producers, or things that eat the primary producers. We talked about energy transfer being about 10%, pyramids of energy and pyramids of biomass, and the inverted pyramid of biomass. So typically we would expect to have a large number of producers and then smaller numbers of consumers. However, in some cases we have an inverted pyramid of biomass if our producers regenerate relatively rapidly, or much more rapidly than our consumers. We talked about biogeochemical cycles and also a little bit on restoration ecology. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out.